C-SPAN update today.
Up next on C-SPAN, we continue with highlights from the annual conference of the group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. The next featured speaker is Noam Chomsky, who's professor of linguistics and philosophy at Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
In the entire United States, there are only two critics of the media that have even the most minimal public recognition and acknowledgement by the mass media, and they're both here today. One is Alex Coburn, who, in terms of fairness and accuracy in reporting, would like it to be known that he's an Irishman and not an Englishman. And the other is Noam Chomsky. Noam, before all of us heard of him, was the foremost linguistic expert in the world, a groundbreaking theorist and theoretician, who found time to switch a good deal of his scholarly endeavors into analysis of the U.S. government behavior abroad, the U.S. government manipulation of propaganda, of the mass media, and the impact on the consciousness both here, on policy here, on the consciousness, and on policy abroad. He's written about Israel in the Fateful Triangle, which was about Israel, Palestine, and the United States. He's written on Central America. He's written on the use of the mass media, its use of terrorism as a reinforcement of U.S. policy. I would say this, from my knowledge of his work, is that he's done the absolute best homework of anybody I know about, and the most trenchant scholarly criticism. He's a one-man walking Columbia Journalism Review. In fact, the Columbia Journalism Review could well go out of business and be replaced by Noam Chomsky for all the real good work that it does. His own request is he simply be introduced as a professor from MIT who cares about the things he covers, and with that, I've introduced you to Noam Chomsky.
Well, let me begin with a recent article by New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis, in which he defends the media against the charge that they've become too independent and too powerful for the public good. He writes that the press is protected by the First Amendment, not for its own sake, but to enable a free political system to operate. In the end, the concern is not for the reporter or the editor, but for the citizen critic of government. What's at stake when we speak of freedom of press, he says, is the freedom to perform a function on the behalf of the polity. Lewis goes on to cite Supreme Court justices and other judges who observed, these are all quotes, that no individual can obtain for himself the information needed for the intelligent discharge of his political responsibilities. By enabling the public to assert meaningful control over the political process, the press performs a crucial function in affecting the societal purpose of the First Amendment. Therefore, quotes, a cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. Now, I do not think that we should accept the view that freedom of expression has to be defended in instrumental terms by virtue of its contribution to some higher good. Rather, it's a value in itself. But that apart, these ringing declarations do express valid aspirations, and they surely express the general self-image of the American media. The question is, what's the relation between that self-image and the facts? The facts seem to me to show something rather different. Namely, in contrast to the conception of the media as cantankerous, obstinate and ubiquitous in their search for truth and their independence of authority, the actual evidence appears to show with quite considerable clarity that the media do serve a societal purpose, but not that of enabling the public to assert meaningful control over the political process by providing them with the information that's needed for the intelligent discharge of political responsibilities, as was just quoted. On the contrary, the actual societal purpose, which the media serve very effectively, is to inculcate and defend the economic, social, and political agenda of privileged groups that dominate the domestic society and the state. The media serve this societal purpose in many ways through selection of topics, distribution of concerns, framing of issues, filtering of information, emphasis, and tone. I think we should agree with Chief Justice Hughes, whom Lewis also cites, on the primary need of a vigilant and courageous press if democratic processes are to function in a meaningful way. But the evidence shows clearly enough that this need is not met or even weakly approximated in actual practice. Now, the reasons for the overwhelming tendencies which I'm describing, they are overwhelming tendencies. You can find a deviation here and there. But the reasons for the overwhelming tendencies in a fulfillment of this actual societal purpose, these reasons are not particularly obscure on essentially guided free market assumptions that are not at all controversial. Simply think about what the private media are. In essence, the private media are major corporations that have a market, namely other businesses called advertisers, and they sell a product, namely readers and audiences, to these other businesses. From an institutional point of view, that's what the corporate media are. Furthermore, the national media, the ones that are most influential in setting the general political agenda and so on, they typically target and they serve elite opinion, groups which on the one hand provide an optimal profile, as it's called, for advertising purposes, and therefore maximize revenue, and on the other hand, play a role in decision-making and in the private and the public spheres. The national media would be failing to meet their elite audience's needs if they did not present a tolerably realistic portrayal of the world, but their societal purpose also requires that the media's interpretation of the world reflect the interests and concerns of the sellers, the buyers, and the institutions dominated by these groups, in particular the state, whatever segment of the business classes happens to be in control of the state at a particular moment. So it's not surprising that this societal purpose should be fulfilled with such dramatic success. In these terms, we can also understand another pervasive phenomena, namely the way in which media personnel adapt to the institutional demands. Conformity to the needs and interests of privileged sectors is simply essential to success. In the media, as in other major institutions, those who do not display the requisite values and perspectives will be regarded as irresponsible, ideological, or otherwise aberrant, and they'll fall by the wayside. Now, there'll be a small number of exceptions, but the pattern is pervasive and expected. Those who adapt, and perhaps quite honestly so, those who adapt will then they'll be perfectly free to express themselves with essentially no managerial control, and they'll be able to assert quite accurately that they perceive no pressures to conform. The media are indeed free for those who adopt the principles required for their societal purpose. Now, there may be some who are simply corrupt, who serve as errand boys for the state and other authority. The description of New York Times correspondent Stephen Kinzer by Edgar Chamorro, who was selected by the CIA as a press spokesman for the Contras. But that's not the norm. The media form part of a larger intellectual community where institutional factors induce similar effects, and they do so in the same manner through the normal workings of power. One immediate prediction from these rather natural assumptions is that nothing that I'm now saying could be understood within the general culture. The reason is that to fulfill their societal purpose, responsible intellectuals must conceal from themselves and from others what their societal function is. Otherwise, that function cannot be fulfilled. So it follows that one could demonstrate quite conclusively, with a huge weight of evidence dealing with every imaginable topic, that the mass media do serve the societal purpose of safeguarding power and privilege, but these results could not be understood. In fact, the words could barely be heard. This prediction, too, is very well confirmed. There's by now a huge mass of evidence in print demonstrating that the media serve their actual societal purpose. The effect of all of that is zero, and I think we could be certain that the evidence, that the effect would remain zero, even if the standards of proof reached those of physics or even surpassed them. There's a good institutional reason for that. Now, the media, in fact, delight in the right-wing jingoist critique that they go too far in their adversarial stance. That provides the occasion for solemn declarations on the need for a cantankerous and obstinate press in a functioning democracy. And furthermore, the criticisms are usually so totally ludicrous that they can be easily refuted. But an accurate description of the media as subservient and conformist is literally unintelligible, and the evidence simply cannot be considered, which makes perfect sense. Again, it's completely explicable on normal grounds of simple institutional analysis. Just to give one example, there's a recent book called Reporters Under Fire, edited by Landrum Balling, which is concerned with U.S. media coverage of the United States and of the Middle East and Central America. Now, it contains a critique of the media as anti-Israel, as unfair to the United States in its noble endeavors. It also contains a refutation of that critique, but barely a word suggesting that a rather different interpretation might be conceivable, and that's very typical and also entirely natural. That's exactly what any reasonable person should expect, looking at the way the society is constructed and it works. Well, let me give one concrete example of how these things work out. I've done a number of analytic studies of the media in Central America. I'll keep to that topic. We could pick any other one, but let's keep to Central America. And these are very revealing. So let me just mention one. I'll come back to another later. This one deals with the New York Times and the Washington Post, the two national media, at a crucial moment of debate over Central America, namely the first 3 months of 1986, when everything was peaking towards the Contra vote, and the amount of attention, in fact, peaked. I reviewed all the opinion columns. That means their own columnists, invited op-eds, and so on. And the point was to determine the range of expressible opinion. The point was not to evaluate particular contributions. Anybody can say what they like, but the question is, what's the range of opinion that's expressible? Now, there's a prediction that comes out that will immediately come to mind. The prediction would be that the range of expressible opinion will conform closely or exactly to the spectrum of tactical disagreement among elite groups. And that, in fact, is precisely verified. Let's first look at the elite groups. There is a tactical disagreement about the best way to, as they put it, contain Nicaragua, or restore Nicaragua to the Central American mode, or restore regional standards. I'm now quoting the liberal Washington Post at the dovish end. Now, notice a few points. One of them is that on the assumptions that are expressed at the dovish end, as here, if the policy of violence and terror were to succeed, then it would apparently be okay. At least there's no indication to the contrary. Second point, notice that there's no need, according from this point of view, the dovish point of view, to enforce any arrangement on Guatemala and El Salvador, where the military are happily slaughtering their civilian populations, or on Honduras, where hundreds of thousands of peasants at that time and still were starving to death while the country exports food. Apparently that's okay. In fact, that is the Central American mode, so we don't have to say anything about it. Notice, third point, notice that there's no need, it seems, to enforce any arrangement on the United States, despite a certain amount of evidence that the U.S. government record on adherence to international law and to treaties may have an occasional flaw to it. Well, that's the dovish end in the media. What about the corresponding debate in Congress? Again, we find pretty much the same spectrum. So just sampling the dovish end again, let's, since we're in California, take the liberal dove, Alan Cranston. He explained in Senate testimony at exactly that time that Reagan's resort to violence had proven inadequate. So therefore, I'm quoting him now, we should isolate the reprehensible government of the Marxists in Managua and leave it to fester in its own juices. In contrast, Pol Pot-style terror in El Salvador and Guatemala, which is backed or directly organized by the United States, that merits no such recommendations. We don't have to let them fester in their own juices. In fact, we should continue to support them in accordance with this critic, who again is about at the outer limits of dissent. Well, that's samples just the dovish extreme. From there it goes over to the hawks. Coming back to there was at that time, there remains tactical debate among elites, but there also is a consensus, and that's also clearly reflected in the 85 columns. The consensus has a number of properties to it. For one thing, the consensus is obviously you've got to be anti-Sandinista, and in fact, out of 85 columns, 85 were anti-Sandinista, most of them harshly so, some less harshly. That means 100% conformity on the major issue. That's a considerable victory for the Office of Public Diplomacy of the State Department and Operation Truth, as they called it. So that's part of the elite consensus. You're only in the debate if you accept certain assumptions. Second point has to do with some of the differences between Nicaragua and, say, El Salvador, the other relevant states, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Actually, there's more to say about Costa Rica than people believe, but let's put it aside. So let's just talk about Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. There's one striking difference between Nicaragua and the others. The most striking difference is that of those four, Nicaragua is the only one that doesn't slaughter its own population. Now, how many columns discuss that? Well, the answer is 0. There's not one word in 85 columns referring to that distinction, which again reflects the elite consensus. Third, there's another striking difference between Guatemala and the other states, and that is, as is not controversial, between Nicaragua and the other states, it's not controversial that in the early phases of the Sandinista revolution, they did direct resources to social reform with rather dramatic success, in fact, until U.S. violence succeeded in restoring them to the Central American mode, or so it's hoped. So how many and that's unique in that respect. How many references are there to that? Well, in 85 columns, there are in fact 2 phrases referring to that fact. There are 0 phrases referring to successful economic development prior to the U.S. attack, although there's no doubt that it took place. In fact, they had the highest growth rate in Latin America with increase in production of subsistence crops and so on. There's no reference to the reports of charitable development agencies such as Oxfam or to the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or other sources which would in fact explain and discuss these things. They're just not part of the debate. Well, all of this reflects a number of things. First of all, it reflects the unimportance of mass slaughter, social reform, economic development, and so on, as compared with what's really important and crucial, namely restoring Nicaragua to the Central American mode, as illustrated, say, in the 2 U.S. terror states or in Honduras. Furthermore, it reflects an elite consensus on enforcing regional arrangements on Nicaragua and Nicaragua alone. Now, you take a look at the 85 columns, there are a few nuances, and when I discussed it in print, there's some comments about that, but that's the general picture very accurately. Well, that study was actually brought to Tom Wicker's attention by some reader, and he expressed his reaction to it on December 31st, 1987, where he reviewed his possible errors over the year. And he has a statement to make about the study, which I doubt that he's ever seen. He says, criticism by foot rule or calculator is often as simplistic as the reportage it purports to measure. Now that's a total comment. It's an interesting comment. Now there could be things wrong with the study, like maybe the facts are wrong, or maybe it's a badly chosen sample, or maybe used the wrong methodology or whatever, but those are not the criticisms. The criticism is just don't study that topic. It's not a legitimate topic. Any possible rational analysis of the media is improper and illegitimate. That's essentially the meaning of that. You can't discuss the way the media satisfy their societal function. No analysis is permissible. There are a few other comments which I won't review, but that's the core of it. Well, you take a look at that and think about it, and you see very clearly the kinds of defense mechanisms that prevent, even in this case, probably the most dissident journalists within the permissible spectrum, that is, from facing any rational analysis of the system within which they fulfill their societal function. That reflects what I said before. Some kinds of critiques simply aren't intelligible. They're unacceptable. They escape the principles of the ideological system, and therefore you can't hear them. I might mention here that if any of those of you who are interested in intellectual history will notice that this degree of blindness and thought control goes far beyond, say, the period of the medieval period. Medieval theologians, say Thomas Aquinas, they felt they had to listen to heresy. In fact, they had to respond to it. They had to analyze it and figure out answers and so on. Now we've achieved a much higher degree of thought control. You just can't hear it. It's enough to say, maybe, criticism can be wrong. That ends the discussion. Well, let me mention a second study, this one unpublished yet. This one deals with the first 6 months of 1987, same two newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, again covering all opinion pieces, columnists and invited op-ed writers. And in those 6 months, there were 61 relevant to U.S. policy in Nicaragua. Now, those 61, 13 prefer negotiations to, you remember, we're now at a point where elite opinion, guys who own the place and run the show, is very much against Contra aid, preferring other means of restoring the Central American mode. So of the 61, 13 prefer negotiations to Contra aid and say nothing about the Sandinistas. That leaves 48 that expressed some kind of opinion about Nicaragua. Of the 48, 46 were anti-Sandinista, 18 of them pro-Contra, 28 anti-Contra, primarily on the grounds that the Contras are inept and can't win, or that the, I'm quoting now, the U.S. goal of forcing Nicaragua into the American democratic mold is not worth the risk. That's John Oakes at the extreme of dissent. So we now have 2 of 48 that expressed some sympathy for the Sandinistas. One was by the Nicaraguan ambassador, Carlos Tunnerman, who was allowed to write a column, so we can dispense with that, which means, in fact, one. And that one was by Dr. Kevin Cahill, the director of the Tropical Disease Center at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, who happens to be the only commentator who could draw upon personal experience in Nicaragua and elsewhere in the Third World. His was also the only column among 61 that took note of the successful Nicaraguan health and literacy programs and what he calls the struggle against oppression, waged under conditions of extreme adversity imposed by U.S. terror. Cahill's is also one of the 2 contributions among 61 that mention the World Court decision. There are 2 others, one by Tunnerman, that have a kind of an oblique reference to international law. Now, that fact's also interesting. It reflects the attitude towards international law and a terrorist superpower. We read there that in these columns that the United States is working through the Contras to restore democracy to Nicaragua and to break the Sandinistas' Cuban and Soviet ties, and that Washington's role is to help contain the spread of the Sandinista revolution beyond Nicaragua. That's the editors of the liberal Washington Post, who prefer taking a chance on reining in the Sandinistas by political development rather than by military assault. And we're treated to charges of, quoting now again, genocide of the Mosquito Indians. That's William Buckley, who concedes that the Sandinistas have not yet reached the level of Pol Pot, but they're plainly heading that way. But apart from Cahill, we read not one word about the constructive policies that were successfully pursued and that in fact, in the real world, elicited U.S. terror to rein in the Sandinistas. The truism that U.S. policies compelled the reliance on the Soviet Union and were explicitly designed with that goal, that's far beyond the realm of discussion, just as even the harshest critics cannot question that the United States is working to establish or even to restore democracy, which must be a reference to the Somoza period if words have any meaning at all. Now, one should not be confused by the fact that there is tactical debate in the media. Obviously, there's going to be tactical if the media are going to perform their societal function of serving power and privilege, they'd better have debate over just those issues which which reflect different tactical options, and they do. But much more significant and intriguing, much more important for people who want to understand how indoctrination and ideological warfare are carried out, is the shared consensus. And that's very striking. In fact, these examples, which are quite typical, illustrate the astonishing conformity to state doctrine among those segments of U.S. opinion that are permitted expression in the free press. Again, tactical debate within the framework of approved doctrine is permitted, even encouraged, but nothing more, and the exceptions are very, very marginal. Well, these same conclusions you'll find anywhere you turn. Pick your topic and you'll find them. So let's consider what's lively now, the fate of the Central American Accords, the ones that were signed, the so-called Arias Plan, though that's misleading, the accords that were signed in Guatemala City in August. Now, the U.S. responded to those accords. Namely, it responded by sharply increasing the attack against Nicaragua. At that time, U.S. CIA supply flights to the Contras had already reached the phenomenal level of about one a day. They were doubled in October and apparently virtually tripled in November, so they reached the level of 2 to 3 a day. The goal was to escalate the conflict and to prevent Nicaragua from relaxing its guard so that loyal journalists could deplore Sandinista totalitarianism. The accords identified one indispensable element for peace in the region, namely that aid to insurgent and irregular forces cease. So we may ask the question, how much discussion was there of this massive attack on the accords and the peace treaty? I found that I did a review of the press on this, appears in the first issue of Zeta magazine a couple weeks ago, and I found, in fact, a handful of phrases throughout the whole press during the first 3-month phase of the accords, and little enough afterwards, although there was incidentally some remarkable falsification in an effort to cover up the facts. For example, the New York Times, when Daniel Ortega came to the OAS meeting in Washington in November, mid-November, he made reference to supply flights, and Contra leader Adolfo Calero was then asked by the press what he thought about that reference to 140 supply flights, and he boasted that the actual number was far higher than that. Had the Times respond to that? Up to this point, as far as I can see, it never mentioned the fact that there were that CIA had escalated supply flights and barely mentioned that they existed. The Times reacted by replacing the phrase supply flights by surveillance flights in both statements. Notice that surveillance flights are still a violation of international law in the accords, but a less severe violation, and therefore apparently more tolerable in the newspaper of record. Now, the two major reasons why these crucial facts have to be marginalized, or in fact virtually totally suppressed. First, they would demonstrate that the United States has played by far the major role in disrupting the accords. Nobody else even comes close. Secondly, they would reveal the completely unacceptable fact that the Contras do not bear even a remote resemblance to guerrillas. Now, if you look at the military analyses in the press, you'll see this is conceded all the time. So Bernard Traynor, for example, who's a military correspondent of the Times a couple of days ago, points out what everybody knows, that if supply flights to the Contras don't go on at this level, they probably will not be able to survive. In contrast, indigenous guerrillas, authentic guerrillas, say in El Salvador, the guerrillas in El Salvador, actually resist a far more formidable military force than the Nicaraguan army without several supply flights a day, or in fact without any known aid from abroad. Now, it's a crucial element of U.S. propaganda repeated almost daily by the more dutiful journalists. James Lemoyne of the Times is notable in this regard. It's a crucial element of the propaganda system that there's what they call a symmetry between El Salvador and Nicaragua, where each one is facing a guerrilla insurrection with popular support. So therefore, the facts must naturally be suppressed, as they are, very effectively. The careful reader, really fanatic reader, reads the whole press, could learn that CIA flights had increased so substantially since the accords were signed that the Contras are, I'm quoting, burying the equipment in their areas of operation, enabling them to fight even if the U.S. military airdrops cease. That's preparation in case Congress doesn't go along in a few days. This report, November 24th, in Newsday, was considered important enough to make the Washington Post on a back page, but the facts are not sufficiently important to suggest that the U.S. may be playing a role in undermining the accords, or to raise questions about the relation between these determined efforts to sabotage the accords and the much maligned Nicaraguan emergency regulations while the country is under attack by a terrorist superpower. Only the most careful reader will be aware that the International Commission of Verification supported the Nicaraguan position that the state of emergency need not be ended until the aggression ceases, and even the careful reader would be very likely, probably not know, that the National Assembly in Nicaragua in November passed a law that decreed a complete amnesty and revoked the state of emergency. Both laws, I'm quoting from the legislation, to go into effect on the date that the International Verification and Follow-up Commission, created in the Guatemala City Accords, conducts the appropriate on-site verification, certifying compliance with the commitments of the accord to terminate the attack against Nicaragua. If you bother to look back at the accords, you will notice that these laws passed by the Nicaraguan Assembly are exactly in the terms of the accords, which means that in November, Nicaragua had complied with the accords despite the escalating U.S. war, the vast increase in CIA supply flights. In this respect, it was radically different than Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. That fact is unacceptable, and therefore it just isn't a fact. As far as I know, that was never even reported. Now, the media do make occasional oblique reference to the failure of the United States to lend adequate support to the accords, but look carefully at how they do it. They don't mention the blatant violations in progress, namely the rapid escalation of the already phenomenal level of CIA supply flights to keep the proxy army in the field. Rather, what they typically refer to is the plans of the Reagan administration to request Contra aid. Now, that's an intelligent form of deceit. It makes it appear that the press is balanced. It's criticizing the U.S. government. But it conceals the ongoing actions that are far and away the most serious disruption of the accords, and it refers simply to plans. Well, plans can later be justified by the alleged failures of the reprehensible Sandinistas to comply, of course, as a result of the escalating U.S. attack, which is designed for this purpose. The actual facts are entirely unacceptable to the U.S. government and were therefore ignored or concealed in the free press. Coming up to more recent times, the New York Times on January 10th published its own comprehensive review of the accords in the magazine section. That was January 10th. There were two articles, one by James Lemoyne on the conflict between Arias and his adversary Daniel Ortega. The other was by Stephen Kinzer asking whether Ortega can be trusted. That's the whole issue. Nowhere is there one word in those two articles referring to the actions of the U.S. government to ensure that the accords cannot be fulfilled. Although these actions were by far the most serious violation of the accords, putting in the shade even the very significant violations in the U.S. terror states. Questions about the two U.S. terror states and the client state of Honduras arose only marginally in conformity with State Department priorities. The Times, for example, would not deign to report that Archbishop Rivera y Damas in early January, Salvadoran Archbishop, once again denounced the practice of torture used against many Salvadorans by the death squads, quoting, adding that bishops in several provinces were reporting increased death squad killings and calling for an end to death squad killings and torture. nor did it report that, according to Western diplomats cited by Reuters on the day of this review, the Contras are hiding in the jungles of Honduras to avoid exposing the government's support for U.S.-funded Contras. However, that kind of suppression is insignificant as compared with the suppression of the violent escalation of the U.S. attack, which is far and away the most serious step that was taken to undermine the possibility that the Accords could proceed. Now, coming back to these two articles, we now have New York Times Magazine's survey of the status of the Accords, 2 articles on Nicaragua. Lemoyne gives an account of Arias, Costa Rica's Arias, which is intended to be laudatory, but in fact, if you read it carefully and think about it, depicts Arias as an opportunist and a moral monster who is unconcerned over terror in El Salvador and Guatemala, and is unconcerned over the horrible conditions that persist in Honduras, or the fact that all 3 states are effectively under military rule backed by the United States, and is unconcerned by the terrorism of the U.S. proxy army attacking Nicaragua. That's one article. We turn to the other one, the companion article by Stephen Kinzer. That denounces Ortega for numerous sins, for example, for running fraudulent elections. That's a staple of U.S. government, hence the free press, always untroubled by fact. Now, as usual, Kinzer cites opposition figures, but also, since he's balanced, he cites one person who he identifies as an old friend of Ortega, and he's permitted to say that Ortega has regressed and no longer reads writers and philosophers, as distinct from Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who was, you know, okay. Well, these 2 pieces, which I've adequately surveyed, they represent the entire coverage of the Accords in the magazine section, which is another notable contribution to the state propaganda system. Notice that conforms precisely to the government agenda. Probably you ask them, they're both against Contra aid, but that's not the point. The point is they're enforcing the elite consensus, the agenda of those who have power. On the same day, Lemoyne had a front-page article reporting, quoting him all the way through, that the prospects for peace in Central America appear bleak, the fault of the Sandinistas, overwhelmingly. Now, for balance, he criticizes the Reagan administration for planning renewed aid for the U.S. guerrillas in Nicaragua. That continues with the standard pretense that the proxy army are guerrillas, and typically suppresses the far more important fact that the administration has acted, not just planned, to disrupt the Accords. He goes on to condemn the Soviet Union for backing Nicaragua's growing army and supporting Marxist guerrillas in the region, offering no evidence for the latter charge, and ignoring the fact that Nicaragua is, after all, under increasing U.S. attack, and that all other sources of aid were consciously blocked by U.S. pressure. Continuing, he says both Nicaragua and El Salvador have what he calls civil conflicts. Both of the Times twins constantly refer to this. But El Salvador, he says, is in a stronger position than Nicaragua because it held direct talks with the guerrillas and, I'm quoting, permitted the leaders of the rebel civilian wing to return from exile to hold several public meetings in El Salvador. While he goes on to say the rebels in El Salvador have enjoyed nearly open access to the press. That's a statement so phenomenal I won't even comment on it. Neither here nor anywhere has Lemoyne or his colleagues, to my knowledge, ever reported that opposition groups in Nicaragua that openly support the U.S. attack against Nicaragua and openly identify themselves with the Contras function perfectly freely, not requiring an international escort to protect them from assassination on a brief visit and needing no bulletproof vests. And they publish a major journal that's funded by the superpower that's attacking Nicaragua, a journal which openly and explicitly identifies itself with the Contras and serves, that's true in fact, and serves as an instrument of U.S. disinformation in the country. Now this fact, to my knowledge, is entirely without historical precedent. I don't think you can find anything that comes even close to it. Certainly there's nothing in U.S. history. Or to take a current case, take, say, Israel, faced with much less of a threat, constantly closing newspapers. In fact, when La Prensa was suspended, Israel closed 2 newspapers. When La Prensa was opened, Israel closed another newspaper, one of them in Nazareth, and also closed the Palestinian News Service. And the reasons were given. This was just endorsed by the High Court a couple of days ago. Goes to the Supreme Court, High Court, and they say, well, we certainly have freedom of expression, but it cannot be used to harm the state of Israel. And no government, they say, will allow a business, however legitimate, that's functioning, that's supported by some hostile power. And the security forces claim without evidence that these journals are supported or related to a foreign power. This is never reported in the United States. I've never seen any report outside of Alex Coburn, who I don't count as part of the United States. And what that shows is that the alleged concern over freedom of the press in Nicaragua is simply a form of total fraud and hypocrisy. It's a form of ideological warfare, just as when some Communist Front organization deplores the human rights violations in the United States and in its domains. Well, coming back to Lemoyne, he states that Nicaragua did not lift its state of siege law, did not offer a full political amnesty, although faced with a similar war. That is a statement that is utterly nonsensical. Faced with a similar war, El Salvador did so. That's a completely deceitful rendition of the actual facts for the reasons I already mentioned, quite apart from the fact that the Salvadoran amnesty was in explicit violation of the terms of the accords and has been bitterly condemned by human rights groups who have repeatedly called for it to be rescinded. Continue with Lemoyne. Particularly damaging for Nicaragua, he goes on, are the Miranda revelations, which he misrepresents, claiming falsely, I'm quoting him, that the Sandinistas defend the government's right to form a large army and to assist rebel groups in El Salvador. A total lie. Most interestingly, Lemoyne goes on to quote Elliot Abrams, who insists that Nicaragua must be held the most responsible for the treaty's lack of success. You'll notice that that's an order that's loyally followed by Lemoyne and his Times colleagues, and in fact the Free Press generally. Well, a closer look at these triumphs of voluntary totalitarianism is actually instructive. Notice that there's a unanimous agreement near unanimous agreement among articulate elites in the United States that Nicaragua must not obtain the means to defend its territory from the CIA supply flights that are required to keep the U.S. proxy army in the field. I might add that the question of illegal U.S. surveillance flights, which are required to coordinate counterattacks, enabling them to evade the Nicaraguan army and attack what are called soft targets in accordance with State Department orders, that's far beyond the possibility of discussion in the free press. Now, all of this is extremely clear, and it's a very revealing fact. Teaches us a lot about our political culture. It's well understood that to defend its territory from constant U.S. attack, Nicaragua must obtain jet interceptors. There's no other way. And therefore, no one familiar with U.S. political culture would be surprised at all to discover that the most severe charge against the Sandinistas, the ultimate proof that they must be destroyed, is the allegation that they're attempting to obtain such aircraft. Any indication that Nicaragua might be attempting to obtain vintage 1950s jet planes from the Soviet Union, the United States having blocked all other sources of supply, that elicits almost hysterical outrage. In fact, what's happening is that Nicaragua is threatening to defend its own territory against U.S. attack. And it's an unchallengeable principle of U.S. doctrine that the United States must be free to attack any country that it likes, and it's intolerable, an unspeakable scandal, if not outright aggression, for any country, however weak, to defend itself, to try to defend itself from U.S. attack. Notice that that's precisely the meaning of the constant hysteria about Soviet MiGs. There's no other meaning to that. And it tells us a great deal about the elite policy consensus, and in fact about the reigning culture more generally. Well, all of these things came to the fore during the Miranda affair. As you recall, I think it was already discussed, so I won't go on with it. There was in fact only one revelation by Miranda that merited even 5 words in the press, and that was that the U.S. government had been lying about the level of Soviet and Cuban advisors, which was far lower, as he revealed, than had been claimed by the United States and was roughly in accord with Nicaraguan reports. But all of that is such a familiar pattern that little attention was warranted, and in fact it was barely reported, though presumably not for that reason. In fact, there was a huge press barrage aiming to show that Managua is threatening, I'm quoting, to overwhelm and terrorize its neighbors. That's the Washington Post. Incidentally, that same Post editorial observed that Nicaragua will be a prime place to test the sanguine forecast that Gorbachev is now turning down the heat in the Third World. Notice that that places the onus for the U.S. attack against Nicaragua on the Russians. It's a pretty neat trick, a very common and impressive achievement of free press agitprop. Well, the factual basis for these impassioned charges, which were echoed widely through the media, was, as you know, that Miranda stated that Nicaragua's attempt, and the Ortega brothers repeated, that Nicaragua was planning to reduce its military forces and to provide light armaments for the population for defense against a possible U.S. invasion, thereby creating a nation in arms on the model of Israel, for example, though at a far lower level. As well, Defense Minister Ortega stated in remarks that were transmuted in a most miraculous way as they passed through the filter of the free press, he stated, "It is not our intention to be an offensive army capable of attacking another country. We simply want to have all modern weapons needed to defend our country." Now, to convert those statements into a threat to overwhelm and terrorize Central America, that's an achievement, even for the free press, which went on to exult that with Soviet help, I'm quoting Lemoyne again, with Soviet help, they plan to build a reserve army of more than 500,000 men, the purpose being to ensure that the party will continue to control much of Nicaragua. Notice that the purpose is not to defend Nicaragua from eventual U.S. invasion. In fact, we know that, Lemoyne explains, defense against possible U.S. aggression cannot be the motive for arming the population, because he simply asserts as definite fact, quote, the United States will not invade Nicaragua, and that settles that issue. It's therefore only a cover for totalitarianism when Nicaragua's population is mobilized, while the U.S. escalates the attack against Nicaragua and carries out regular, constant, large-scale military maneuvers on its border. And there's certainly no reason for Nicaragua to pay any attention when high American officials comment that they expect that, I'm quoting, the end result of the RIS peace plan will be to increase the likelihood of a U.S. invasion of Nicaragua. It's also quoted by Lemoyne, whose capacity for self-refutation appears to be unlimited. Well, still another stunning revelation of the Miranda affair was that Nicaragua was planning to obtain jet planes to defend its territory from the escalating U.S. attack, an intolerable outrage, as I've already mentioned. And so Nicaragua has made it clear repeatedly that they would be delighted to obtain French Mirage jets, for example, but that fact can't be reported. The reason is it would give the game away, and it would also undermine the ominous references to the Soviet-supplied Sandinistas, which are necessary to keep the domestic population in line. So Stephen Kinzer, for example, has to be able to report, quoting him, that Miranda's dramatic revelations included documents outlining Soviet plans to continue expanding the Sandinista army through 1995, that is, Nicaraguan plans to defend themselves with supplies from the only source that the United States will permit. Well, it's a rather striking fact that in the midst of all of this carefully orchestrated furor over these outrageous Sandinista plans to try to defend themselves from U.S. attack, right in the middle of that, on December 15th, the United States began shipping F-5 jet planes to Honduras. That fact was literally not reported by the New York Times, apart from subsequent reference in quotes from Ortega and Arias that was buried in articles on other matters. Well, in still another rather intriguing propaganda coup, James Lemoyne, among others, announced that in response to Miranda's charges, Defense Minister Ortega, I'm quoting him, seemed indirectly to confirm the existence of Sandinista assistance to the Salvadoran rebels. You take a look at what Ortega actually said, and what he said is, we are not arming the Salvadoran rebels. He said the Salvadoran guerrillas have some resources and ways to get weapons. They are armed through their own efforts, not depending on outside sources. They are self-sufficient. That became, in the free press, an admission that the Sandinistas are assisting the Salvadoran rebels. I leave it to some logician to figure out how that one works. This allegation of Nicaraguan support for the Salvadoran rebels, that's pretty important for Lemoyne, because one of his major doctrines is that Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala are quite alike in that they all face what he calls externally backed guerrilla war. Now that's a crucial element of Washington propaganda, so therefore it is the duty of the free press to insist upon the claim no matter how absurd it may be. Now even James Lemoyne's vivid imagination can't conjure up KGB supply flights to the Salvadoran guerrillas at the level of 2 to 3 a day to keep the guerrillas in the field, not to speak of Soviet bases nearby for the proxy armies, collecting intelligence for the Salvadoran guerrillas through regular surveillance by flights and offshore naval vessels to facilitate terrorist attacks, running constant military maneuvers near the borders to force the country to remain under permanent mobilization in defense against an invasion threat, dominating much of Salvadoran radio and television with hostile propaganda and so on. And given the inability to conjure that up, you got to do the best you can. Hence his grasping at the straw of Ortega's comment saying that there is no aid to the El Salvador guerrillas, turned into reconstructed in the required fashion to say that there is such aid. Well, Lemoyne has actually made a noble effort, got to admire it, to establish this required symmetry required for doctrinal reasons. In August 1987, he reported that though rebels in El Salvador deny receiving support from Nicaragua, quoting him, ample evidence shows it exists, and it is questionable how long they could survive without it. He presented no evidence, then or ever, and he has yet to comment on the fact that the State Department efforts to substantiate these claims are derisory and were dismissed by the World Court virtually without comment, but it's required for propaganda, so it's a fact. And the Times' efforts to protect this required fact are pretty intriguing. After Lemoyne's statement of alleged fact appeared, Fair wrote a letter to the Times asking them to share Lemoyne's ample evidence with the readers. The letter wasn't published, but they did receive a private response from the foreign editor, who acknowledged that there was no evidence and that Lemoyne had been, as he called it, imprecise. Well, Lemoyne and the Times have had ample opportunity since to correct this imprecise report, and they've used it, namely to repeat the charges that they privately acknowledge to be without merit. Lemoyne does this regularly, either explicitly, as in the cases I mentioned and plenty of others, or implicitly in his constant reference to the alleged symmetry, I'll hurry up, between El Salvador and Nicaragua. I will skip lots of other cases. There's case after case in which the Times since then has referred to these facts since they're required, they're therefore true. Well, let me just finish up by asking how the U.S. government succeeded in imposing its required interpretation of the Central American Accords. It's really a brilliant example of the way the free press operates and fulfills its societal purpose. What was the shared consensus? What was the elite agenda? One, you have to demonize the Sandinistas. That was done completely. Two, you have to establish a symmetry between El Salvador and Nicaragua, and you have to place the whole conflict in a Cold War context. That was achieved. Three, you have to contrast the four democracies with their elected leaders, on the one hand, with totalitarian Nicaragua, where there were no elections and where democratic rights don't exist, as we find in the military-run terror states. That was a complete success, which is an astonishing achievement if you look at the facts. Four, you have to eliminate the U.S. role in demolishing the Central American Accords by undermining the one indispensable element for peace. Remarkable success. Fifth, you have to focus the Accords solely on Nicaragua, reinterpret them so that Nicaragua's compliance is non-compliance. Now, that was actually achieved only in mid-January, when Ortega agreed to go far beyond the Accords, abandoning the simultaneity condition that was at the core of the agreement, and agreeing that Nicaragua alone would enact the provisions. There were headlines all over the U.S. press saying that Nicaragua now agrees to comply with the Accords, though of course you can't trust them, meaning here the Accords as they were fashioned in Washington and reiterated by the free press, which have no relation whatsoever to the text of the Accords, which has long been forgotten. So the simultaneity structure, which is the core of the Accords, that's out the window. Sixth, it's necessary to restrict all diplomacy and all monitoring to Central America, to eliminate any international involvement. Reason, Central American countries are weak. They're U.S. clients. They're subject to U.S. pressure, so there's no big problem. On the other hand, if you allow the Contadora countries and the UN and the OAS, you may not be able to boss them around totally. That, incidentally, is the reason why why the United States has always been opposed to a Contadora agreement and why the press has suppressed most of the information about the Contadora history. Well, that result was also achieved in January. As you know, there was an International Commission of Verification, which was supposed to monitor the agreements. It submitted its report in January. That was the most important diplomatic event of January. That report identified the United States as the primary violator of the Accords. There was because of the aid to the Contras, the supply flights, and so on. It also there was a press conference, and the members of the Verification Commission informed the press that they were unable to discuss the particular countries in Central America because Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador refused, which tells you exactly what they would have reported. A Latin American diplomat informed the press that the Latin American members were shocked, I'm quoting, shocked by the attitudes of patent fear expressed by trade unionists and dissidents in El Salvador and Guatemala, obviously useless information. All of this was suppressed in the New York Times. The New York Times had one sentence referring to the Verification Commission report in a column by James Lemoyne, in which he said, falsely as in fact, that there was no agreement. Well, the falsification is minor. What's much more significant is that all of that was eliminated. Eliminated because it's just unacceptable to the U.S. government, therefore it wasn't a fact. The commission was then disbanded. That leaves monitoring completely in the hands of the Central American presidents, essentially in the hands of the United States, which can be pretty sure of lining them up. The unacceptable participation of independent elements is therefore excluded. That demolishes another central element of the Accords. Recall that this is a triumph of the free press, which is performing its societal functions. Well, my intention originally was to go on with the New York Times for another couple of weeks, but I'll skip that. It's about the same story as we continue, and the rest of the press is not all that different. Let me just finally say that these impressive achievements of the free press are by no means unprecedented. The press has helped in the past to undermine and destroy peace agreements and accords by shaping them into an instrument of U.S. policy. What we're discussing here is systematic institutional behavior. It's on a par with the commitment of corporations to maximizing profit and market share. That's why the pattern is so pervasive. That's why it's going to remain so, in essence, until the society itself undergoes a significant degree of democratization. Thanks.
Why don't we discussing, clapping is much less interesting than discussing, and we haven't got much time because I talk too much. So it's very hard for me to see people because the lights are too bright. So if there's some way for somebody out there to identify people who want to talk, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, we have questions.
Oh, you have questions written? Oh, okay.
So, you want to sit down, okay? We'll have time for a few questions, both Jeff and Noam will take questions. The first question, would you comment on Bill Moyer's program in November '87 called Constitution in Crisis, Our Secret Government? Did you support it or feel you may have influenced it? Either one.
If you're going to leave, please leave quietly. We have we're going to take a couple more questions. The question was, what about Bill Moyer's documentary on PBS? How many people in this room saw it? I think it was an example of the mainstream finally coming and dealing in a very good way, a very forthright way, with the same issues that the alternative media had been dealing with the previous few years. And what's interesting is that the reaction that that program got from just the broad public was a lot of praise. The mainstream media, TV critics praised it. People in their letters and phone calls to not only PBS, but to PBS's sponsor, which was a financial concern, I believe. Which one was it? Payne-Weber? Or, yeah, I think it was Payne-Weber. The response was overwhelming, and that's the kind of thing I was talking about earlier. When the mainstream media does do good journalism, people in the public should respond and let that network know that we were happy with it. And I believe that's what happened when the Bill Moyers documentary aired.
Mr. Chomsky, 2 questions, please. Is Israel a democracy, as the media continually say? And how are U.S. and Israeli interests different? How are U.S. and Israeli interests different?
Well, you know, there's nothing, you can't, with regard to whether some state is a democracy, there's no yes or no answer. There are a lot of dimensions of democracy. They are independent, you know, you can be more or less of a democracy and so on. As far as Israel's concerned, within the Green Line, within Israel, I mean, of course, in the occupied territories, the question doesn't even arise. It's a harsh military administration. That's not up for discussion. Within the Green Line, Israel itself, there are 2 populations. There's a Jewish population and a Palestinian population, an Arab population, now approximately 20%. With regard to the Jewish population, it's a very vibrant democracy. In fact, very much so. I'd say more than this one is for us. However, bear in mind that it's a Jewish state. And it's just a logical impossibility to have a Jewish state which is a democracy, just as it's a logical impossibility for the United States to be a white state and to be a democracy, or to be a Christian state and to be a democracy. That's just not a possibility. We don't even have to discuss it. The only question that arises is, in what respects does the Jewishness of Israel prevent it from being a democracy? And in fact, there are innumerable respects, some of them pretty severe. So, for example, over 90% of the land, I'm talking about inside Israel proper, over 90% of the land is, through various legal and administrative arrangements, in the hands of an organization called the Jewish National Fund, which is committed by virtue of its legal contract with the State of Israel to work for the benefit of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin. Now, that has enormous consequences, as you can imagine, throughout the society, and there are a lot of other things like that. So these are all necessarily deviations from democracy. On the other hand, by other measures, take freedom of the press, the thing we're talking about. I mean, the media within Israel are much more vibrant and lively than the media here with regard to almost any issue, the Hebrew press, that is. So you can't answer yes or no. As to U.S. and Israeli interests, here again we have to be cautious. The very idea of national interests, U.S. interests, Israeli interests, that's already a mystification. There's no such notion. I mean, what's called the national interest by political scientists and journalists and everybody talks about this nonsense, because it is nonsense. What's called the national interest is, in fact, the interest of groups that are powerful enough to dominate the domestic society and the state. And that may be completely opposed to the popular interest. For example, you and I don't have any interest in slaughtering people in Honduras, in El Salvador and Guatemala, or having them starve in Honduras, but that happens to be the national interest. That's the policy we've developed and so on. With regard to the Middle East, there is a state interest and an elite interest, which is to control the energy in the Arabian Peninsula. That goes back to the 1940s, no time to document it here. And there has been there's been a policy debate among U.S. elites, a significant policy debate since about 1970 as to how best to achieve this interest. As always, there's a hard line and a soft line. The hard line says what we need is various cops on the beat, as Nixon's defense secretary put it, a strategic asset. What we need is, at that time it was Iran and Israel, now it's primarily Israel. We need a militarized state which will be a base for the projection of American power in event that the indigenous population gets funny ideas in their head about controlling their own resources. That's the hard line. If you believe in that line, which has in fact won out on the debate, in fact it's very strongly pressed by Israel and by its so-called supporters here, who are in fact its worst enemies in my opinion. If you believe in that, then what you want to do is maintain the military confrontation, block a political settlement, ensure that Israel remains militarized, a pariah state dependent on the United States, available as a threat against its neighbors, and also available for secondary services throughout the world. You may have noticed that during the Iran-Contra hearings, one high Israeli official was quoted as saying that Israel has become just another federal agency available when the U.S. government wants to carry out some action. It's kind of a mercenary state available for various tasks, like supporting genocide in Guatemala when the U.S. government is blocked by congressional human rights legislation and so on. That's the hawkish side. The dovish side would say, no, we can achieve our results in that, our aims in that region by accepting a political settlement, by seeing Israel integrate into the region as its most advanced industrial sector, and so on and so forth. If you believe in that, you'll be in favor of a political settlement. Now, in fact, as everyone ought to know, there is an overwhelming international consensus in favor of a political settlement. Outside the United States, everybody knows what it is. It means a two-state settlement with the Palestinians granted national self-determination in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, all kinds of arrangements for security and so on. The only thing that's really blocking it is the United States. Of course, Israel objects to it, and the United States has backed them in that rejectionism. As long as that goes on, the conflict will, of course, continue, and that goes on because the hawkish line has won out. Here, the media have been crucially important. The facts of the matter are simply inexpressible. Even at a moment like today, when you're reading a lot of criticism of Israel for the very harsh and often barbaric treatment of the Palestinians, you take a look carefully at the editorials, the letters to the editor, etc., you'll notice there's one theme that runs through it, one theme that runs through them. It's terrible, it's harsh, we're pained, and so on, but what can Israel do? There's nobody to talk to. There's no peace camp in the Arab world. You know, there's nothing corresponding to the say, dovish Labor Party or to Peace Now. The facts of the matter are precisely the opposite. The major states in the Arab world and the mainstream of the Peace PLO have been advocating publicly, openly, a political settlement for well over 10 years. In fact, back in 1976, the United States actually had to veto a Security Council resolution calling for a full-scale political settlement, which was supported by the Arab confrontation states and supported openly by the PLO, even written by the PLO, according to Israel. And that continues up till today. Just this month, Arafat again, PLO again, offered to negotiate with Israel, leading to mutual recognition. That's been going on for years. The problem is there's no major group within Israel, neither of the political parties is willing to consider a political settlement. And the United States so far has been backing them. And that's the reason why there has to be continuing conflict and where there will continue to be. Now, that's not in our interest. So I certainly don't think it's in the interest of the people in Israel. It's obviously not in the interest of the Palestinians. It's not in the interest of the people of the United States. In fact, it might very well lead to a nuclear war. It's come close in the past, but it is the national interest. So as long as that remains the national interest, as long as we can't change the national interest to be something else by modifying U.S. policy, then unfortunately there will be a coincidence between U.S. national interest and Israeli national interest in opposition to the actual interests of the populations in both countries.
Before we go on to the next question, I want to introduce a late arriving member of the audience who is in town to try to get the media to hear another side of the story in Central America and El Salvador in particular, who will be interviewed by The Weekly, among other publications, and that's Ruben Zamora, the Vice President of the Democratic Front in El Salvador. And I asked Ruben to come out and just say hello for a couple of minutes.
Thank you very much for this very warm welcome. Now you have a lot of questions to Chomsky. Seems to be the same thing that happened in Managua when he was giving the lectures there. And my wife was suffering a lot because she was translating for him into Spanish.
You shouldn't give away the fact that I don't know a word of Spanish. That's unfair.
Anyway, I just came for a moment to say hello and to say hello to Noam as well, because I am here in Los Angeles for 3 days. Operation California has been helping me to arrange the program, trying to see some people and different groups. I'm talking a little bit about the situation in El Salvador and what we are trying to do right now in El Salvador, especially in the view that we have decided to stay there and to fight politically, because it seems to us that the right moment for trying to develop that work has been arriving in El Salvador. Last time that we were there, what most struck me was that to perceive the feeling of the people, or the need among the people for new alternatives in El Salvador. They want a way out to the present crisis in El Salvador, of course with justice and with dignity and democracy. And it seems to us that the moment has come in El Salvador that we will try to pull together as much as possible different political and social forces and trying to work it out, a solution among Salvadorians and for the Salvadorians. And in that sense, what I want to tell you tonight as a little commercial to all of you who work in the media is that something that struck us a lot is that although we see internally, even in the US government, at the level of State Department, Pentagon, and National Security Council, that the preoccupation about what is happening to them in El Salvador and how the project that they have tried to establish in El Salvador is deteriorating, we do not see that situation still being reflected through the media among the people in this country. Still, it seems to us that the concentration of all the news about Central America on the case of Nicaragua is diverting the light or the spot on the serious problems, and very serious problems that exist in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador itself. And that for the effort that means the Esquipulas agreement to succeed, we cannot forget that if we only try to see that the problem is in Nicaragua, there is not going to be any solution in Central America. If we do not tackle the problem in El Salvador, in Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua and Costa Rica as well, there is no possibility for a Central American solutions to the problem. And I think this is something.
For those of you who are not at the Central American session this afternoon, my name is Jay Levin. I'm the editor of the LA Weekly. And what you saw me doing a moment ago, holding up this white paper, was going to work for the television people, and that reminds me that one of the points that hasn't been made today is one of the best ways to change the media is to go to work for it. I have the pleasure of introducing both Jeff Cohn and Noam Chomsky this afternoon. Jeff Cohn is the leading founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and the sponsors of this quite excellent event. And his background, which may interest you, is that he started as when I first met him, as a young journalist trying to do reporting for alternative papers, including the Weekly. Decided to become a lawyer, went to law school, became an ACLU lawyer for a while, was very active on the community level, a number of extraordinarily important issues in the late 70s and early 80s, the fight against utility rate hikes, the massive fight against the police brutality and police spying. Jeff filed the first case on the police spying case, filed the first suit. And his interest in transforming media and his awareness of the profound biases of media and the limitations on the range of opinions that are allowed led him to start FAIR 2 years ago. He's asked me not to say too much more about him and let you meet him on his own, so here he is, Jeff Cohen.
Thank you, Jay. I made a little tour of the different workshops. A lot of them looked very, very interesting. A lot of you may have noticed that there was this sign up that said disinformation in the lunchroom. And I prefer it to be there because usually we get disinformation in the newsroom. We've gotten a lot of questions about why mainstream media representatives were not at this conference complaining to us, and the complaint shouldn't be directed at us. We spent months trying to line up representatives from the mainstream media without much success. This is a historic conference. 1,300 people are here, and we had to turn away hundreds. And I think the huge turnout reveals the intense frustration and anger that is felt by progressive thinking Americans with the media 7 years into the Reagan administration. The goal of this conference, the goal of FAIR as an organization, is to turn this frustration and anger into action. We need to come away from this conference with new resolve that it is too late for activists to grumble to each other quietly about the media. Whether you are active in the fight to stop the U.S. war against Central America or the nuclear arms race, whether you're active in efforts to save the environment or to work for economic rights for the poor and the homeless, whether you're active in the consumer movement or the labor movements that work against corporate greed and corporate merger, you know that your viewpoints are generally excluded from the mainstream media. Instead of complaining to each other, it's time that activists began to confront the media directly, began to challenge media bias directly, and that's what FAIR is all about. What we need to do is build a movement of media activists that will ensure that leaders of the public interest community speak for themselves on the U.S. media. The nuclear freeze movement in the early 80s was arguably the biggest grassroots movement of the decade. It had definable organizations, hundreds of organizations across the country, thousands of individual volunteers, with national groups that were very definable leaders, but when it came to debating the nuclear freeze issue on national TV, which was not debated a hell of a lot, the leaders of that movement, who were generally women, rarely were allowed to debate in behalf of the freeze. That's the kind of thing we've got to stop in the future. Until the media hear from us loudly and clearly, they will continue to ignore our spokespersons. You can look at the way the media have covered the Contra issue in the last couple weeks. Look who has been on the air. Elliott Abrams, and more Elliott Abrams. The same broadcasters who week after week ask the question, can Daniel Ortega be trusted, have not once turned to Mr. Abrams and said to him, Mr. Secretary, given your history, why should we believe even one word that you are telling us today? Remember, Elliott Abrams does not lie. He just deliberately misleads. Yesterday, Abrams appeared without opposition on NBC's Today Show. A week ago, he appeared on the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour. He got 2 segments on the air. The Democratic congressman only got 1 segment on the air. Dozens of people complained to NBC and to PBS. But what needs to happen in the future, and what FAIR has come into existence to ensure, is that thousands of calls go to those networks when this Elliott Abrams trick happens over and over and over. FAIR is not the only organization that is taking note of the narrow spectrum of views in American television. Columnists in mainstream dailies are making the very same criticism. Howard Rosenberg, the TV critic of the LA Times, wrote an article shortly after the Iran-Contra scandal broke. His article was called "Rerunning the Experts at Crisis Time." It was about 2 days before Thanksgiving. The scandal was mushrooming, and Howard took a look at who were the experts on America's public affairs TV shows. It was pretty easy to keep track of who these people were, because it was basically the same few people coming on every single show. This is what he found on Tuesday, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, 1986. On McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, Alexander Haig, Zbigniew Brzezinski. On Nightline that night, Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger. On the Today Show that day, Alexander Haig. On the CBS Morning News, Kissinger. On Good Morning America on ABC, Brzezinski. So Howard counted 5 different programs and had the same 3 experts on every show. That's the kind of thing that we've got to change. Conservative bias on TV is very, very obvious. Perhaps the best way to see it is the number of partisan right-wingers who host their own television shows. The list goes on. Bill Buckley, for years and years, has hosted a show on PBS. His colleague at the conservative magazine National Review, John McLaughlin, hosts 2 shows every week, mostly on PBS, sponsored by General Electric. Conservative columnists Bob Novak and Roland Evans host a show every week on CNN. Patrick Buchanan co-hosts a show every night on CNN. George Will does not host a show, but for a while he was the lone commentator on ABC National TV News. So you add to this list about a half a dozen other right-wing preachers like Jerry Falwell and Jimmy Swaggart, and until he left TV politics to get into presidential politics, Pat Robertson. And what's important when you add in these religious shows to the other public affairs shows hosted by right-wingers is to remember that these religious shows are among the most ideological on television. These shows regularly sanctify the Contras while denouncing groups like the Nuclear Freeze, the ACLU, the National Organization for Women, and a host of other groups that I've never been able to find in my Bible. When I debate conservatives and I run through this list, I challenge them to name one partisan of the left who hosts a national TV show. The responses I get would be funny if it didn't reveal such a sad situation. The name that comes up a lot is the old Leninist himself, Phil Donahue. Now, I really don't know that much about Phil Donahue's private politics, but I know that the show he hosts is not heavily political, as are these shows I've just listed for the right wing. In fact, I caught a promo a while ago for a Donahue show. I didn't get to catch the show. It was a promo, Mothers, Daughters, do they share the same sexual fantasies? And I didn't watch it, but I was wondering if the theory was that fantasies are inherited. I don't know. Now, the other left-winger on TV, when you hear from conservatives, is John Chancellor. I think the best way to define Chancellor is certainly not a left-winger, but he puts forward consistently hardline positions from the militant center. During the Vietnam War, He was head of Voice of America for Lyndon Johnson. And then there's the other so-called TV leftist, Dan Rather, the old bushwhacker himself. Now, if you look closely at CBS Evening News and you analyze the way they have covered the Reagan administration, you find that they rarely veer from the Reagan line when it comes to Central America or the nuclear arms race. CBS News dispensed with and dismissed Gorbachev's unilateral nuclear test moratorium so fast that the administration didn't even have to worry about it. The rest of the media joined in. CBS News, until recently, until FAIR complained, was using White House phraseology. They were referring to aid to the Contras, so-called non-military aid, as humanitarian aid. That term is false. It's false according to Geneva Conventions. It's false according to any international group that gives humanitarian aid. Under those rules of humanitarian aid, it can only be given to civilian non-combatants. It cannot be given for political purposes. It has to be given to civilians on all sides of the conflict. By all three criteria, it is not humanitarian aid. The right wing was upset with Rather because they felt he was, quote, disrespectful to the vice president. I'm wondering if the right wing remembers this thing called the First Amendment. We need an adversarial press. The question that should be asked is why, during the pre-summit interview that President Reagan had with Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and the CNN anchor person, why the questions were such puffballs, ready to be hit out of the park. The only questions that implied any criticism of Reagan were questions that came at him from the right wing. Dan Rather's question was a question that suggested that Ronald Reagan might not be tough enough to stand up to those Ruskies. When that kind of performance happened, we should be asking ourselves, people who think along progressive lines, why we did not deluge the switchboards of CBS, NBC, ABC, and CNN. Seven years into the Reagan administration, and Dan Rather expressed a little toughness, tried to get a question answered, and the right wing lit up the switchboards. When the media is asleep at the wheel, we should be letting them know that we want them to act like journalists. We want a fourth estate and not a fourth branch of government. Unless a social movement builds to demand some sense of balance on American television, things will get worse, and in fact, they're getting worse. Every time you look around, another right-winger is hosting a new show. How many people in this room have seen the Morton Downey Jr. show? It's a show that was sort of a, it seems to me, and I'm just guessing, a ripoff of your Wally George show. I'm not exaggerating when I say that that show resembles a Nuremberg rally on the air, and it's national, syndicated on every single night. This fall, there will be a new show. It'll be hosted by another partisan of the First Amendment and a partisan of democracy. This show will be hosted by G. Gordon Liddy. Every single night, 5 nights a week. This narrow spectrum on U.S. television runs from the center, people like Chancellor and Dan Rather, to the right wing. And I think it's clear that the narrow spectrum of views on American television has to do with the narrow spectrum of ownership, the corporate ownership of the U.S. media that you've heard so much about today. The portion of the spectrum that is usually excluded from American television and the mainstream media is those people that represent the public interest, the peace movement, the environmental movement, the consumer movement, labor. Those groups that tend to conflict with big business have a hell of a time getting their views expressed on the media, and that's the kind of thing FAIR is trying to change. It's not surprising that the impact of corporate ownership on the U.S. media is one of the least discussed issues in U.S. television. Since the early 1980s, ABC News has been having this television program called Viewpoint. Viewpoint is hosted by Ted Koppel. It allegedly looks at the toughest media controversies during that period. They've had some 20 Viewpoint programs on ABC News, and they haven't seen fit to air even one program about the narrowing corporate ownership of the U.S. media. We've got to let ABC News know that that's not good enough, and we want to see one of the key issues about the media discussed on that program. Remember when the right wing was trying to take over CBS News? In the words of Jesse Helms, we want to become Dan Rather's boss. Well, Tom Brokaw at NBC has a new boss. His boss is General Electric, and it's got far less attention than it certainly deserves. General Electric is the second largest military contractor in the country, the second largest vendor of nuclear power, the third biggest builder of nuclear weapon systems. It's safe to say that no country in Western Europe would ever, it would be inconceivable in Western Europe that a corporate colossus like General Electric would be allowed to own the biggest TV network in the country. Look at a 22-minute newscast on NBC. There's virtually not a story that they could cover that would not raise a potential conflict of interest with their corporate parent, General Electric. Nuclear power, nuclear weapons, military appropriations. GE owns Kidder Peabody, a Wall Street firm. The way NBC covers the insider trading scandal could affect its own profits. And you have labor issues and environmental issues. It's a serious issue, and the group that is raising the issue over and over is FAIR. We think it's about time that people started raising the question of whether General Electric should be forced to divest itself of NBC. It's an elementary democratic demand. You might think that's a radical demand, but we heard it raised on the floor of Congress by a very moderate congressman a few months ago. Congressman Slattery. He's even a swing vote on the Contra issue, but on this one, he thinks it's an obvious democratic issue to raise. We should support that quest. It would be a very educational campaign. Most people who watch NBC haven't a clue that General Electric owns that network. You know about the group INFACT. It's an alliance of church groups and peace groups that has been trying to get people to not buy General Electric products until they get out of the nuclear arms race. You may not know that that group, INFACT, tried to get its 30-second TV commercial aired on the TV stations of Washington, the one affiliated with NBC and the ones affiliated with other corporate owners. They were not able to get their 30-second commercial on the air. The First Amendment on television seems to protect your right to say, buy GE, we bring good things to life. But it doesn't protect your right to say, boycott GE products. It's not just General Electric. If you read the book, The Media Monopoly by Ben Bagdikian, you'll see that much of the media is interlocked with the military-industrial complex. Columbia Journalism Review has reported that half of the board members of the New York Times are also on the boards of directors of military contractors. If you don't think that conservative and corporate ownership of the media has impact on the politics of the media, it's worth remembering the experience of Neighbor to Neighbor and the 30-minute television program that group produced and tried to buy time on American television stations. Neighbor to Neighbor was refused the right to buy airtime for its program criticizing the Reagan Central America policy. They were refused this right on station after station in Los Angeles and San Francisco. They even went to one station in San Francisco with a briefcase full of money ready to buy time. And they went to the same stations that regularly aired Falwell and Robertson praising the Contras. Earlier, before Neighbor to Neighbor was formed, a group of individuals produced a 30-minute TV program that was pro-nuclear freeze. And there was a 30-minute TV program that was anti-freeze. And these two programs went around the country trying to buy airtime, offering the same money. According to a New York Times article, November 25th, 1985, the right-wing show was able to buy time or was given free airtime 5 times as often as the peace-oriented show or the pro-freeze show. Let's move from corporate television to what is supposed to be public television. PBS certainly airs the best documentaries on television, but its public affairs talk shows tilt distinctly to the right. 2 editors, Bill Buckley and John McLaughlin, from the same right-wing magazine, National Review, host 3 weekly programs that are aired on a majority of PBS stations across the country. Where are the national PBS public affairs shows for those people who write or edit The Nation magazine or Mother Jones magazine? PBS has an affinity for programs that are British. The Nation, as you know, has 2 top-flight columnists, Alexander Coburn and Christopher Hitchens. I think they would have a good show or 2 between them. FAIR has already talked to a committee of the board of PBS. We've put this proposal before them that in the interest of fairness and balance, there should be programs hosted by progressives on PBS, but I don't think that's going to come to pass until they hear from thousands of people who are regular subscribers to public broadcasting demanding that those shows be on the air. On public TV stations, business viewpoints are well represented. There are 2 weekly shows, Adam Smith's Money World and Wall Street Week. There's 1 show every day, the Nightly Business Report. It's aired on 80% of PBS stations. Why is there not 1 public affairs show on public television that deals with the public interest constituencies, those groups that conflict with big business, the environment, labor, consumers, peace? FAIR has already put that proposal before a committee of the board of PBS. We need people out in America to support that request so that there is a show that represents the rest of America and not just the business elite. If you read FAIR's newsletter Extra, you know that some of our campaigns have brought results. When PBS was having trouble finding airtime for a hard-hitting documentary on the religious right, we publicized the issue. Mark your calendar. That show, Thy Kingdom Come, will air on April 6th on PBS stations. If you read our newsletter Extra, and I encourage everyone to subscribe to it, that's the way we sustain our research, you probably know that we're raising a very simple democratic demand. We're asking that media organizations make financial disclosures when they air or report stories that directly impact the profits of their company or their corporate parent. Our society demands that politicians and government officials make full financial disclosures. It's about time that we made the same demand of media organizations. An example of why we need that occurred on NBC in March of 1987. NBC aired a 1-hour documentary that was sympathetic to nuclear power. When Tom Brokaw introduced the documentary, shouldn't he have said at the outset, NBC News is owned by General Electric, which has substantial investments in nuclear power. Now I turn to our correspondent to begin the documentary. Such an announcement, I think, would perhaps have made some viewers of that documentary look at the show as perhaps sort of like a 1-hour TV commercial for nuclear power. It's certainly how I saw it. Financial disclosure should not be confined to television. In recent months, newspaper after newspaper have editorialized against the fairness doctrine for broadcasters. These editorials have almost never referred to the fact that these newspapers are owned by corporations that own broadcasting outlets. Over and over, these editorials referred to the plight of broadcasters. They didn't let their readers know, for instance, when the Chicago Tribune pleaded argued against the Fairness Doctrine, they did not mention the Tribune Company owns 10 broadcasting stations. Miami Herald didn't point out when they editorialized against the Fairness Doctrine that Knight Ridder owns 10 stations. Des Moines Register did not point out when it blasted the Fairness Doctrine that its owner, Gannett, owns 24 broadcast stations, on and on and on. The next time that kind of thing happens, each of these newspapers has got to hear from constituents and readers, and they have to hear that that is not good enough. We want full financial disclosure of the U.S. news media. Out of our New York headquarters, we monitor and challenge media bias on a daily basis. In recent weeks, our focus has been on the Nicaraguan coverage. Through regular correspondence and dialoguing with reporters and editors and TV producers, we've been able to get some small changes made. Some reporters have abandoned the inaccurate term humanitarian aid for the so-called non-military aid to the Contras. Some reporters are beginning to point out that the regional peace accord calls for an end to all aid to the Contras. Tom Brokaw and others have reported that the regional peace accord calls for an end to military aid to the Contras. That's at best half true. The actual wording of the accord, and you should write it down so you can call the news media, the wording calls for an end to all aid, military, logistical, financial, and propaganda. If the media had been doing its job since the Arias Accord was signed on August 7th, and they'd been pointing out that the Arias Accord appeals for an end to all aid, then it would make even what the Democrats are doing look accurately like the United States government, both parties, are undermining the regional peace accord. But the U.S. media hasn't pointed that out. Some journalists are noticing that it's not Nicaragua, but Honduras, a U.S. client state that has been the main signatory country that is undermining the regional peace accord. Admittedly, these are very little changes, but when you do media work, and until we build a big movement, we savor these very, very small victories. They're significant to us because in politics, a lot of politics is the art of labeling. In our dialogue with media professionals, we try not just to harangue. In fact, we try to avoid animosity. We try not to lose our temper. Sometimes we try to be very, very helpful. On a Nightline show a little while ago, Ted Koppel objected on 2 occasions to an assertion by a Nicaraguan government spokesperson that the Contra policy is very unpopular with the U.S. public. And to be helpful, we rushed over to Nightline all of the polling data that we could scrape up in a day. And we sent them the polls that showed the American public is opposed to Contra aid 2-1. We even sent to ABC News one of the polls that had been commissioned by ABC News. Apparently, Ted Koppel was not aware of it. When reporters are mischaracterizing the Arias Accord, we send over copies of the Arias Accord. When talk show hosts seem to be having trouble locating representatives of the peace movement, we send over phone numbers of representatives of the peace movement. I want to wind up now by just thanking everyone for coming out. I know it's been a long day. It's been an exceptional conference. I want everyone to get involved get involved in media criticism, be polite, but be forthright, and let's see what changes we can bring about. Los Angeles is a media center. The issue of corporate domination of the media and corporate censorship are big issues in this city. There's much educational work to be done here. We expect to have many more educational events in this city. We hope soon to be able to open an office in Los Angeles. I urge you all to continue to work with us to bring about changes in the media.
something that has to be make aware the American people that is necessary to achieve. Thank you very much.
We have to be out of here very quickly, so we'll have two more quick questions, and I'll ask that the answers be kept as briefly as possible. If voices of opposition are magnified and excluded from dialogue within the mainstream press and branded as ideologues, could you discuss the relationship between ideology and the concept of accuracy in media as proposed by an organization such as FAIR? Is there such a thing as media objectivity? Is it mostly a question of who has access to the media apparatus? Jeff, you want to answer that first?
Yeah.
Why don't you answer?
Okay. Real short. I think that the idea of objectivity in the media is largely a myth. What we try to stress at FAIR is that we demand of the media that they provide balancing views when they do stories on foreign policy. Instead of 80% of the sources of the U.S. mainstream media coming from the federal government, usually the executive branch of the government, instead of that, there should be balancing views on all foreign policy reports. What we ask of reporters, and some do better than others, is that the reporters in Washington should look to spokespersons from disarmament organizations and look, when there's an issue of economics, there should be balancing viewpoints of labor organizations and consumer organizations. You see that more in the mainstream press, the quality press of Western Europe. You don't see it very much in the mainstream press of the United States. I think objectivity is a myth, but balance is something that can be strived for by journalists.
Last questions for Noam, which is, and it's, what do you regard as indispensable sources of alternative information?
Well, I just came in time to hear Alex Coburn answer that question earlier for a lot of you. And I think essentially what he said is correct. I mean, the main answer is what's above your neck. You got to think. Actually, there is plenty of information around. If you read carefully and extensively, you'll find, even in the mainstream free press, lots of information. So if you really read like a fanatic, you could discover that the U.S. was escalating the war against Nicaragua and that I was destroying the Accords. If you'd read, say, the Christian Science Monitor, you would have discovered what the International Verification Commission reported. If you read Alex Coburn's columns every 2 weeks, you'll get a very good antidote to most of the press. And there's alternative media and so on. The main thing is to think, to think through what you're reading. If you read that everyone in the United States, from dove to hawk, is screaming their heads off because Nicaragua is trying to defend its own territory, think what that means. What does that mean about us? What are they not saying? And so on. I mean, the real answer to this question is, I'm a little less skeptical than Jeff about objectivity. Maybe, I hang around scientists too much. I think you can tell the truth. I mean, the truth is not entirely obvious. There are alternative ways of looking at it and so on, but there is a truth out there. And the way to get media that will tell the truth is to ultimately to democratize the society. I mean, to break down the concentrations of power that are determining that the truth is filtering through a certain set of interests. Now, even when it filters through that set of interests, you can learn something about things, but you have to work much harder. If we have alternative organizations with their own media, their own journals, organizations strong enough, or even people organized enough to pressure the existing media, you can shift them towards what I would call objectivity. telling a more honest version of the truth, also allowing a wider range of opinion, and so on. But there's always going to be a tension. And there's a tension between centers of power, which want to shape the world into their interest, and the general population, which ought to be fighting against them. First of all, to try to break down centers of power and to democratize the society, but also to compel them to, or to create alternatives ourselves, which will present a version of reality that is more true to it and is also more true to actual human needs and interests.
I want to thank you all for coming. You've been a remarkable audience. Thank you for coming.